The medical bay smelled like antiseptic and ozone. HFY Sullivan sat in his wheelchair, staring at the metal fingers of his left hand. The cybernetic limb moved when he wanted it to, but it felt cold and lifeless. Not like the arm he had lost. 15 years ago, during the war. Dr. Helena Grant walked into the room carrying a data pad and a cup of coffee. Behind her came Jake Morrison with his recording equipment. The human filmmaker looked nervous as he set up his cameras. HFY had that effect on most humans. Even sitting down, the Zephyrian veteran was imposing. His gray skin was covered in scars, and where his right eye should have been, a red cybernetic implant glowed softly. "Thank you for agreeing to this interview," Dr. Grant said as she sat down across from him. Her voice was calm and professional. "I know this isn't easy for you." HFY made a sound that might have been laughter. "Easy? Nothing has been easy since I met your kind human." Jake finished setting up his equipment and nodded to Dr. Grant. The red recording light blinked on. Helena looked at her notes and then back at HFY. "Please state your name and rank for the record," she said. HFY Sullivan, former Fleet Admiral of the 3rd Zephyrian Expansion Force. His voice was deep and rough like gravel in a metal container. "Though I suppose titles from a dead empire don't mean much now. The Zephyrian Empire isn't dead," Helena said gently. "Your people signed a peace treaty with the Human Alliance. Trade between our worlds is growing every year. HFY's good. I fixed on her. The empire I served is dead. What exists now is something different. Something your people changed us into." Jake leaned forward slightly. This was exactly the kind of perspective they hoped to capture. Stories from the other side of the war were rare. Most Zephyrian veterans refused to talk about their experiences fighting humans. "Can you tell us about your first encounter with human forces?" Helena asked. HFY was quiet for a long moment. His metal fingers tapped against the arm of his wheelchair. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. "We called you the soft ones back then. Pink flesh and weak bones. Your ships were smaller than ours. Your weapons were less advanced. On paper, you should have been easy to defeat." He paused. "We were very wrong about that." "What made you realize you were wrong?" Helena asked. "Time. Pain. Watching my soldiers die in ways that made no sense." HFY shifted in his chair. "But it started on Kepler 442b, a research station. Should have been simple." Jake checked his equipment. The audio levels were good, and HFY's face was clearly visible in the camera frame. The alien's expression was distant, as if he was seeing something far away. "Our intelligence said the station had maybe 50 humans, scientists and support staff. No military presence." HFY's cybernetic eye flickered. "Intelligence was wrong about many things during the war." "What happened when you arrived?" Helena prompted. "Standard procedure. We surrounded the station and demanded surrender. Your people had 12 hours to evacuate or be removed by force." HFY made that sound like laughter again. "They responded by broadcasting music, old human songs. Something called rock and roll. Very loud, very aggressive. My communications officer thought it was some kind of psychological warfare." HFY looked at his metal hand again. He wasn't entirely wrong. Helena made a note on her data pad. "Did they surrender after the 12 hours? They sent a message. A human female, middle-aged, wearing a white coat. She looked directly into the camera and said 3 words. HFY paused. "Come and take it." Jake couldn't help but smile slightly. That sounded like humans, all right. "So you attacked?" Helena asked. "We landed 3 full battle groups. 1,500 soldiers against 50 humans." HFY's voice became quieter. "It should have been over in minutes, but it wasn't." "No, it was not." HFY was silent for almost a full minute. Helena waited patiently. She had interviewed many war veterans, both human and alien. Sometimes the hardest parts took time to put into words. My soldiers were well-trained, elite troops. They had fought in 6 successful campaigns against other species. They knew how to take a fortified position. Kethver's good eye focused on something beyond the camera. But they had never fought humans before. What was different about fighting humans? Everything. The word came out like a growl. Other species fight logically. They follow patterns. When they are outnumbered, they surrender or retreat. They value their lives above temporary objectives, and humans don't. Humans make no sense. Kethver's cybernetic fingers clenched into a fist. They fight when they should run. They attack when they should defend. They refuse to quit even when winning is impossible. Helena leaned forward. Can you give us a specific example? Kethver was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made both humans in the room uncomfortable. There was a human male, young, maybe 20 of your years. He was hit by plasma fire that should have killed him instantly. Burns over 60% of his body. Any rational being would have fallen and died. Kethver shook his head slowly. This human kept fighting. He used his own burning jacket to blind one of my soldiers, then took the soldier's weapon and shot 3 more before he finally collapsed. Jake swallowed hard. He had heard stories like this from human veterans, but hearing it from the other side made it more real somehow. Did he survive? Helena asked. Yes, your medic somehow kept him alive long enough for evacuation. I saw him again later in the war. Kethver's cybernetic eye dimmed slightly. He had become an officer, still fighting despite scars that covered half his face. That must have been difficult to understand, Helena said. Difficult. Kethver looked at her directly. Doctor, do you know what it's like to realize that everything you know about warfare is useless? That your enemy doesn't follow any rules you understand? Helena shook her head. It changes you. It makes you question not just your tactics, but your entire way of thinking. Kethver gestured with his metal hand. We Zephyrians value efficiency, logic. We fight to achieve objectives with minimal loss. Humans fight to win, regardless of cost. Is that what you learned on Kepler 442b? That was only the beginning. The research station fell eventually, but it took us 6 days. 6 days to defeat 50 humans. We lost over 200 soldiers. Kethver's voice became bitter. And when it was over, we discovered something that changed everything. What was that? The humans had evacuated all their civilians on the first day. The people we fought weren't scientists or support staff. They were volunteers who stayed behind just to slow us down. Kethver looked at both humans in the room. They died for nothing but time. A few extra hours for their people to escape. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had never heard this story before. That's when I realized we weren't fighting a normal species, Kethver continued. Normal species fight for territory, resources, survival. Humans fight for ideas. For each other. For concepts that have no physical form. Helena made another note. How did that change your approach to the war? Kethver's laugh was harsh and bitter. It didn't. Not at first. I reported that humans were more difficult than expected, but still defeatable with proper tactics. I requested additional troops and better intelligence. He paused. I was still thinking like a Zephyrian. I thought if we just applied more force, more logic, we could solve the human problem. But that didn't work? No, Doctor. It made everything worse, much worse. Kethver stared at the wall for a long moment. His cybernetic eye flickered as if accessing old files stored in his memory. Dr. Grant waited quietly, knowing that pushing too hard would make the veterans shut down completely. The real lesson came. 3 months later, Kethver finally said. After Kepler 442b, High Command decided I needed more ships and better intelligence. They gave me a full battle fleet and told me to secure the Proxima sector. Jake adjusted his camera angle slightly. The alien's scarred face was becoming more animated as he spoke, and Jake wanted to catch every expression. We had learned that humans had established several colonies in that area. Small settlements, maybe a few thousand people each. The plan was simple: arrive with overwhelming force, demand surrender, and process the humans for relocation. Kefver's metal fingers drummed against his wheelchair. It should have been routine, but it wasn't, Helena asked. Nothing involving humans is ever routine. Kefver's good eye focused on her. We jumped into the Proxima system expecting to find scattered civilian populations. Instead, we found Commander Lisa Torres and the human military exercise fleet Phoenix 7. Helena made a note. She had heard of Commander Torres during her research. The woman had become something of a legend. During the war, Torres was conducting training exercises with 12 human warships when we arrived. Her force was outnumbered 5-1 by my fleet. Kefver shook his head slowly. By all military logic, she should have retreated immediately. What did she do instead? She attacked. The words came out flat and emotionless. No warning, no attempt at negotiation. The moment our ships appeared, Torres launched every fighter and missile she had and charged straight at my flagship. Jake leaned forward. Combat footage from that battle was classified, but survivor accounts had made it into legend among both species. The first thing that confused my tactical officers was the formation. Human ships spread out in what looked like random patterns. No structure, no coordination that we could see. Kefver's cybernetic eye glowed brighter. We tried to predict their movements using standard combat algorithms. Every prediction was wrong. How so? Human tactics are not based on efficiency or logic. They are based on chaos and improvisation. Torres would order a ship to break formation and attack alone, then suddenly have it retreat while 2 other ships flanked from impossible angles. Kefver made a sound of frustration. My computers could not calculate responses fast enough. Helena nodded. Human military doctrine emphasized adaptability over rigid structure, but hearing it from an enemy perspective was enlightening. Real problems started when Captain Ben Hayes boarded my command ship, Kefver continued. Boarded? How did a human manage to board a Zephyrian flagship during active combat? Kefver was quiet for almost a minute. When he spoke, his voice carried a mix of admiration and bitter memory. Hayes and his team used an old human tactic called ramming speed. They loaded a damaged fighter with explosives and crashed it into our docking bay. The explosion created a breach that should have killed everyone in the area. Kefver touched his scarred face. Instead, Hayes and 6 soldiers came through the breach wearing environment suits and started fighting their way to the bridge. Jake's eyes widened. 7 humans against an entire Zephyrian crew? Against 3,000 trained soldiers, yes. And they were winning. Kefver's voice became quiet. Hayes had studied our ship design somehow. He knew exactly where to go and what systems to target. While my security forces tried to stop his team, he was destroying our navigation computers and weapon control systems. How long did this last? 47 minutes. 7 humans held control of my flagship for 47 minutes, while the space battle continued around us. Kefver looked at his metal hand again. Hayes personally destroyed our main computer core and killed my second-in-command before his team finally retreated. Helena wrote quickly on her pad. How did they escape? They didn't retreat through the breach they created. Hayes led his team to the shuttle bay and stole one of our own ships. They flew it back to the human fleet while broadcasting our tactical frequencies to Torres. Kefver's laugh was harsh. They used our own communication system to coordinate attacks against us. Jake shook his head in amazement. The audacity of it was incredible. What happened to the overall battle? Helena asked. We won, technically. Torres was forced to retreat after losing 5 ships. But the cost was enormous. My fleet lost 2 capital ships and 14 smaller vessels, nearly 8,000 casualties. Kethver's cybernetic eye dimmed. Against 12 human ships that should have been destroyed in minutes. How did High Command react to your report? They didn't believe it at first. The casualty numbers seemed impossible. A full Zephyrian battle fleet taking heavy losses from a small human training squadron? Kethver shook his head. They sent investigators to interview survivors and examine the wreckage. Helena waited for him to continue. The investigators found something that changed everything. When Hayes destroyed our computer systems, he left behind a message recorded in our own language. Kethver's voice became very quiet. It was addressed to me personally. What did it say? Tell your fleet admiral that this was just practice. When we fight for real, it will be much worse. Kethver looked directly at Helena. That message was played for every senior officer in the Zephyrian military. It became famous. Jake felt a chill. Human psychological warfare was apparently effective even against alien psychology. How did this change your understanding of humans? It made me realize we were not fighting a normal military force. Normal enemies try to minimize casualties and preserve resources. Humans do the opposite. They take risks that should be impossible and succeed through sheer determination. Kethver shifted in his wheelchair. Hayes could have simply sabotaged our systems and escaped. Instead, he chose to send a message designed to demoralize my entire species. Did it work? Yes, after that battle, Zephyrian soldiers began to fear human attacks. They had heard stories about Hayes boarding a flagship with 6 soldiers, about Torres attacking a superior force without hesitation, about humans who kept fighting with fatal wounds. Kethver's metal fingers clenched. Fear is a weapon humans understand better than most. Helena made another note. What was your next encounter with human forces? High Command decided that individual human heroes were the problem. They thought if we could eliminate leaders like Torres and Hayes, human resistance would collapse. Kethver's laugh was bitter. They gave me an even larger fleet and orders. To capture Proxima Station, the supply depot? Yes. Intelligence said it was defended by maybe 200 humans under Colonel Rick Davis, a supply station with minimal military presence. Kethver looked at both humans in the room. We brought 15,000 soldiers and 50 ships to capture 200 humans. Jake adjusted his recording equipment. That seems like overkill. After fighting Hayes and Torres, nothing seemed like overkill. We had learned that humans were dangerous, but we still thought we could overcome them with sufficient force. Kethver's good eye focused on something beyond the camera. We were still thinking like Zephyrians. We still believed that superior numbers and firepower could solve any problem. But you were wrong again? We were wrong about everything. The siege of Proxima Station lasted 4 months. 4 months to capture a supply depot from 200 humans. Kethver's voice became very quiet. By the end, I wasn't sure who was besieging whom. Helena leaned forward. What happened during those 4 months? I learned that humans are not just good at fighting. They are good at surviving, at adapting, at turning any situation to their advantage. Kethver touched his scarred face again. Colonel Davis turned that supply station into something that defied everything we knew about warfare. How so? Humans don't just defend positions. They improve them. Every day the siege continued, the station became stronger. Davis had his people manufacturing weapons from station components, creating new defensive systems, even growing food. In improvised gardens, Kethver shook his head. They turned a simple supply depot into a fortress that could have held off an army. Which it did. Yes, which it did. Kethver's cybernetic eye dimmed as if the power was running low. Dr. Grant noticed the change and gestured to Jake, who paused his recording. Do you need to rest? Helena asked. We can continue this later. No. Kethver's voice was firm. The story of Proxima Station needs to be told. Your people should know what Colonel Rick Davis and his soldiers accomplished. Jake resumed recording. The alien veteran sat straighter in his wheelchair, despite the obvious pain it caused him. We arrived at Proxima Station with overwhelming force. 50 warships, 15,000 soldiers, enough firepower to destroy a small moon. Comfer's metal fingers traced patterns on his wheelchair arm. The station was a simple supply depot. Metal corridors, storage bays, basic life support. Nothing special. What was your initial assessment? Helena asked. Standard siege protocol. Surround the target, cut off supplies and communications, wait for surrender. The station had 200 humans and maybe 6 months of supplies. Kethver paused. It should have taken weeks at most. Jake leaned forward, but it didn't. Colonel Davis responded to our surrender demand within an hour. He broadcast a message on all frequencies so every ship in my fleet could hear it. Kethver. Good eye focused on Helena. He said, and I remember his exact words, "We're not going anywhere, alien. If you want this station, come and take it." Helena made a note. Those words had become famous during the war, but she had never heard them from the Zephyrian perspective. My tactical officers recommended immediate assault. The station's defenses were minimal. A few plasma cannons, some missile batteries. Nothing that could stop a determined attack. Kethver shook his head slowly. I decided to be cautious. After fighting Torres and Hayes, I wanted to observe human behavior before committing my forces. What did you observe? Something impossible. The humans began improving their defenses while we watched. Davis had his people strip components from non-essential systems and build new weapons. They turned cargo containers into armor plating. They converted maintenance tunnels into firing positions. Kethver's voice carried a note of amazement. In 3 days, that simple supply depot became a military fortress. Jake checked his equipment. The story was becoming more intense, and he wanted to capture every detail. How did they do it so quickly? Human ingenuity. They don't just use tools for their intended purpose. They see possibilities that other species miss. Kethver gestured with his cybernetic hand. A Zephyrian engineer looks at a cargo container and sees storage space. A human engineer sees potential armor, or a weapon mount, or a shield generator. Housing. Did this change your attack plan? Yes. I decided to tighten the siege gradually. Cut off their supplies completely and wait for them to exhaust their resources. Kethver's laugh was bitter. I thought I was being clever. Patient, strategic. Helena waited for him to continue. Lieutenant Mary Johnson was their communications officer. A young human female, maybe 25 years old. My intelligence officers said she was just a technician, not a threat. Kethver's cybernetic eye flickered. They were wrong about that too. What did she do? Johnson somehow managed to maintain communications with human fleets throughout the siege. We were jamming all standard frequencies, monitoring every transmission, intercepting every message. Kethver shook his head. She found ways to communicate that we didn't even know existed. Jake raised his eyebrows. Such as? She used quantum entanglement transmitters hidden in routine maintenance signals. She bounced messages off cosmic background radiation. She even used the station's waste disposal system to send coded information through debris fields. Kethver's voice carried grudging admiration. Every time we blocked one method, she found 3 others. Helena wrote quickly. Human communication networks during the war had been remarkably resilient, but hearing the specifics was fascinating. What kind of information was she transmitting? Everything. Our ship positions, patrol schedules, weapon loadouts, even personal conversations between my officers. Kethver touched his scarred face. Johnson was turning my own fleet into intelligence. Sources for human command. How did this affect the siege? Human supply ships began appearing at impossible times and locations. They would drop supplies and disappear before my patrols could respond. Sometimes they would attack my outer ships and escape before reinforcements arrived. Kefver's metal fingers clenched. Johnson was coordinating these attacks from inside the station we were supposedly besieging. Jake shook his head in amazement. She was running operations against your fleet from behind your own lines? Yes, and it got worse. The supplies being delivered weren't just food and ammunition. Human engineers were somehow getting manufacturing equipment into the station. Kefver's voice became quiet. Davis and his people began producing their own weapons and equipment. Helena leaned forward. They were manufacturing inside the station during the siege. Complex electronics, advanced weapons, even small spacecraft. They turned storage bays into factories and began mass-producing military hardware. Kefver looked directly at her. Within 6 weeks, the station had better defenses than when we started the siege. Jake felt a chill. The implications were staggering. My officers began requesting permission to assault the station directly. They said the siege was becoming counterproductive. Kefver's cybernetic eye dimmed again. I refused. I had seen what happened when humans were cornered and desperate. I didn't want to face that on their own ground. So the siege continued for months. And every day, the humans became stronger. They built new weapons, expanded their defenses, even started launching their own attacks against my fleet. Kefver's voice carried pain and frustration. Davis had somehow turned defense into offense. Helena made another note. What kind of attacks? Small craft built inside the station would emerge from hidden launch bays and strike my supply ships. Human soldiers would use maintenance pods to board and sabotage my outer vessels. They even started psychological warfare. Kefver paused. That was the worst part. Psychological warfare? Johnson began broadcasting messages to my troops. Not threats or demands, but stories. She told them about human families, about children waiting for their parents to come home, about the reasons humans were fighting. Kefver's good eye focused on something beyond the camera. She spoke to my soldiers as if they were people, not enemies. Jake swallowed hard. How did your troops react? Some began questioning the war. They started asking why we were fighting humans who seemed so much like us in some ways. They wondered if their own families were worried about them. Kefver's voice became very quiet. Johnson was making my soldiers think about things soldiers shouldn't think about during a war, such as whether the war was right, whether humans deserved to be conquered, whether there might be better ways to resolve our differences. Kefver looked at both humans in the room. She was turning my own people against the idea of fighting yours. Helena realized the implications. The siege was becoming politically unstable. Yes, High Command began receiving reports that my fleet's morale was deteriorating. Some officers were requesting transfers. Others were filing formal complaints about the conduct of the siege. Kefver's metal fingers drummed against his wheelchair. Johnson's broadcasts were being recorded and distributed throughout the Zephyrian military. They were becoming famous. What did High Command order you to do? End the siege immediately. Either capture the station or destroy it, but stop the psychological damage to our forces. Kefver's cybernetic eye flickered. They gave me 72 hours to achieve victory. Jake adjusted his camera. What did you decide? I chose to assault the station directly. I committed 8,000 soldiers to a full-scale attack. Kefver's voice became very quiet. It was the worst mistake of my military career. What happened? Davis was ready for us. Every corridor had been turned into a kill zone. Every room was a fortress. Every human defender fought like they were protecting their own families. Kefver touched his scarred face again. My soldiers faced opponents who refused to retreat, refused to surrender, and refused to die easily. Helena waited for him to continue. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it ended, I had lost 3,000 soldiers. The station was still in human hands, and Davis was broadcasting surrender demands to my fleet. Cuthbert's laugh was harsh and painful. The humans we had been besieging for 4 months were demanding that we surrender to them. Did you? No, but I should have. Cuthbert sat in silence for several minutes, his cybernetic eye flickering like a dying light. Dr. Grant could see that telling this story was taking a physical toll on the alien veteran. His breathing had become labored, and his metal hand trembled. Slightly. We can stop here if you need to rest, Helena offered again. No. Cuthbert's voice was firm, despite his obvious discomfort. The worst parts need to be told. Your people need to understand what happened at Wolf 359. Jake adjusted his recording equipment. He had heard the name before. Wolf 359 was where the war had truly turned, though most humans didn't know the full story from the alien perspective. After the disaster at Proxima Station, High Command relieved me of duty for 6 months. They said I needed time to recover from my injuries and reassess human capabilities. Cuthbert's good eye focused on Helena. When they brought me back, it was for the largest military operation in Zephyrian history. Wolf 359? Yes, High Command had decided that individual battles were meaningless. They wanted to destroy human military power completely in one massive engagement. Cuthbert's metal fingers traced patterns in the air. They gave me a fleet of 300 ships and orders to eliminate Admiral Peter Clark's entire battle group. Helena made notes quickly. Admiral Clark had become a legend among human forces, though he had died during the battle. What was your assessment of Clark as an opponent? Dangerous. More dangerous than Torres or Hayes, because he understood large-scale strategy as well as individual tactics. Cuthbert's cybernetic eye glowed brighter. Intelligence reports said he had been studying our previous battles and developing new approaches to fighting Zephyrian fleets. What kind of approaches? Clark realized that humans couldn't match our firepower or numbers directly, so he developed what he called dispersal tactics. Instead of fighting our fleet as a unit, he would scatter his forces and attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Cuthbert shook his head slowly. It was chaos warfare on a massive scale. Jake leaned forward. How do you fight against chaos? You don't. You try to impose order and hope your discipline holds longer than their creativity. Cuthbert's voice carried bitter experience. Clark had 150 ships against my 300. By traditional military mathematics, I should have won easily. But traditional military mathematics don't account for human behavior. Exactly. Clark divided his fleet into 15 small groups that attacked from different angles and at different times. My ships would engage one group while 2 others hit us from behind. We would turn to face the new threat and find 3 more groups attacking our flanks. Cuthbert's metal hand clenched into a fist. It was like fighting ghosts. Helena wrote rapidly. The Battle of Wolf 359 had lasted 18 hours and involved nearly 500 ships from both sides. How long did the battle last? Too long. 18 hours of continuous fighting. My ships were designed for decisive engagements, not extended combat. Human ships were smaller but more efficient. They could keep fighting longer than we could. Cuthbert's voice became quiet. By hour 12, I realized we were losing. What changed your mind about the battle? Captain Susan Miller and the UE's defiance. Cuthbert's cybernetic eye dimmed as if the memory caused him pain. Her ship was part of Clark's reserve force, held back for the final phase of the battle. Jake adjusted his camera angle. What made her ship special? Nothing. It was an older vessel, smaller than most of Clark's fleet, with standard weapons and armor. Cuthbert looked directly at the camera. What made it special was Miller herself. How so? Miller brought her ship in during the final hours when both fleets were exhausted. My flagship was damaged but still functional. I was preparing to withdraw and regroup when she attacked. Kefver's voice carried a mix of admiration and horror. She came straight at us. No evasion, no tactical maneuvering, just direct assault. Helena leaned forward. That sounds like suicide. It was suicide. Miller's ship was destroyed within minutes, but she knew that would happen. Kefver's metal fingers trembled. She turned her ship into a weapon. What do you mean? Miller ordered her crew to abandon ship, but she stayed at the helm. She aimed defiance directly at my flagship and activated the self-destruct sequence. Kefver's good eye closed for a moment. She turned her entire ship into a massive bomb. Jake felt his breath catch. He had heard stories about ramming attacks, but this was different. The explosion destroyed both ships and created a debris field that changed the entire battle. Clark used the wreckage to launch surprise attacks that broke my remaining formations. Kefver's voice became very quiet. Miller's sacrifice gave the humans their victory. Were you injured in the explosion? Yes, badly. I was thrown across the bridge when the ships collided. My right eye was destroyed by flying metal. My left arm was crushed by falling debris. Kefver touched his scarred face. I should have died. Helena waited for him to continue. I was unconscious when human rescue teams boarded the wreckage. When I woke up, I was in a human medical facility. Kefver's cybernetic eye flickered. Dr. Greg Thompson was working to save my life. A human doctor treated you? Yes, Thompson and his team spent 12 hours performing surgery to repair my injuries. They gave me blood transfusions, replaced damaged organs, even installed temporary cybernetic implants to keep me alive. Kefver looked at his metal hand. They saved my life while the battle was still raging outside. Jake shook his head in amazement. Why would they do that? You were their enemy. That's what I asked Thompson. When I was strong enough to speak, he said something I will never forget. Kefver's voice became soft. He told me that healing was his job, regardless of species or politics. He said humans believe that all thinking beings deserve medical care. Helena made careful notes. This was exactly the kind of perspective she hoped to capture. How did that make you feel? Confused, angry, grateful, all at the same time. Kefver's metal fingers drummed against his wheelchair. I had spent years fighting humans, watching them kill my soldiers, losing friends to their weapons. But here was a human risking his own life to save mine. Did you talk to Dr. Thompson about the war? Every day for 2 weeks while I recovered. Thompson would check on my injuries, and we would discuss philosophy, medicine, the nature of conflict. Kefver's cybernetic eye glowed brighter. He helped me understand something important about human nature. What was that? Humans can separate the individual from the ideology. Thompson could heal me as a person while still opposing what I represented as a soldier. Kefver looked at both humans in the room. That kind of thinking doesn't exist. In Zephyrian culture, Jake adjusted his recording equipment. How so? We see enemies as completely other. Different species, different values, different worth. Humans see enemies as people who happen to disagree with them. Kefver's voice carried wonder. Thompson treated me like a patient who needed help, not like an alien invader who deserved to die. Did this change your perspective on the war? It changed everything. While I was recovering, I had time to think about all my encounters with humans. Torres, Hayes, Davis, Johnson, Miller, Thompson. Kefver counted them on his metal fingers. Each one had shown me something different about human nature, such as courage, creativity, determination, compassion, but also something else. Something that took me weeks to understand. Kefver paused. Hope. Helena looked up from her notes. Hope. Humans fight differently because they believe differently. They don't fight just to win battles or capture territory. They fight because they believe the future can be better than the present. Kethver's good eye focused on something beyond the camera. That's why Miller could sacrifice herself for victory. Why Thompson could heal his enemies. Why Johnson could speak to my soldiers about peace. Because they believed in something beyond the immediate conflict. Yes, they believed that war would end someday and that how they fought would matter in that future. Kethver's voice became very quiet. I began to wonder if they were right. Dr. Grant looked at her watch and realized they had been recording for over 3 hours. Kethver appeared exhausted, but there was something different about his expression now. The bitterness that had marked his earlier words was fading, replaced by something that might have been peace. What happened after you recovered from your injuries? Helena asked gently. Kethver shifted in his wheelchair, his cybernetic eye flickering as he accessed older memories. Dr. Thompson said I was healthy, enough to be transferred to a prisoner exchange facility. But before I left, he asked me a question that changed my life. Jake leaned forward slightly, making sure his equipment was capturing every word. What did he ask? He wanted to know if I thought the war could end without destroying both our species. Kethver's metal fingers traced patterns on his wheelchair. Arm. At first, I thought it was a strange question. Wars end when one side wins and the other loses. But Thompson saw it differently. Yes, he said humans had been studying Zephyrian culture and society during the war. They had learned that we were not evil, just different. He believed there might be ways for our species to coexist. Kethver's voice became thoughtful. He asked if I would be willing to help explore those possibilities. Helena made careful notes. This was the first time she had heard about early peace negotiations from the alien perspective. Did you agree? Not immediately. I was still a Zephyrian officer with duties to my empire. But Thompson's question stayed with me during the transfer process. Kethver paused. And then I met Ambassador Karen White, the human diplomat. Yes. White was responsible for prisoner exchanges and humanitarian issues during the war. She was the one who arranged my return to Zephyrian space. Kethver's cybernetic eye glowed brighter. But she also made me an offer. Jake adjusted his camera angle. What kind of offer? She said the human government was interested in opening unofficial communication channels with progressive Zephyrian leaders. People who might be willing to discuss alternatives to total war. Kethver looked directly at Helena. She asked if I would be willing to serve as an intermediary. That must have been a difficult decision. Impossible. I was a military officer who had sworn loyalty to the Empire. But I was also someone who had seen what continued war would cost both species. Kethver's voice carried the weight of old pain. I had watched too many good soldiers die for objectives that seemed less important every day. Helena leaned forward. What convinced you to help? A message from my own government. When I returned to Zephyrian space, High Command wanted a full report on human capabilities and weaknesses. Kethver's metal hand clenched into a fist. They wanted me to recommend strategies for total human extermination. Jake felt a chill. Total extermination? Yes, the military leadership had decided that humans were too dangerous to be allowed to exist. They wanted plans to destroy every human world, every human ship, every human settlement in the galaxy. Kethver's good eye closed for a moment. They wanted genocide. Helena stopped writing. How did you respond? I told them the truth. That humans were indeed dangerous, but not in the way they thought. I said that trying to exterminate humanity would probably result in the destruction of the Zephyrian Empire instead. Kethver's voice became quiet. They didn't want to hear that. What did they do? They relieved me of command permanently and ordered me to remain silent about my experiences. No reports, no interviews, no discussion of human tactics or capabilities. Kethver's cybernetic eye flickered. They wanted to suppress any information that might contradict their plans for genocide. Jake shook his head. But you didn't stay. Silent. No. I contacted Ambassador White through secret channels and agreed to help with peace negotiations. Kefver looked at both humans in the room. It was treason by Zephyrian law, but I couldn't let my species commit suicide by attacking. Yours. Helena resumed writing. How did the peace process begin? Slowly and carefully. White arranged for me to meet with other Zephyrian officers who had fought humans and survived. We began sharing our experiences and realizing that we all had similar stories. Kethver's voice carried a note of wonder. Stories about human courage, ingenuity, and compassion that didn't match official military doctrine. What kind of stories? A ship captain who had been rescued by human medics after his vessel was destroyed. A ground commander whose wounded soldiers had been treated in human field hospitals. A pilot who had been shot down and hidden from execution. By human civilians. Kethver counted them on his metal fingers. Every officer who had extended contact with humans came away changed. Jake leaned forward. Changed how? They stopped seeing humans as enemies to be destroyed and started seeing them as opponents to be respected. They began questioning whether the war was necessary or winnable. Kethver's cybernetic eye glowed brighter. Most importantly, they started believing that peace might be possible. How did you convince the Zephyrian government to negotiate? We didn't convince them. They convinced themselves. Kethver's laugh was bitter. The final human offensive made it clear that continued war would destroy the Empire. Helena looked up from her notes. The final offensive? Admiral Clark's replacement, Admiral Frank Taylor, launched what humans called Operation Starfall. Simultaneous. Attacks on 50 Zephyrian worlds using tactics learned from previous battles. Kethver's voice became very quiet. It was everything we had taught them about warfare, refined and perfected. How successful was it? Devastating. In 6 months, human forces captured or destroyed half of our remaining fleet and occupied 12 major Zephyrian colonies. Kethver touched his scarred face. But that wasn't the worst part. Jake adjusted his recording equipment. What was worse? The occupied worlds weren't destroyed or enslaved. Humans established humanitarian governments and began providing medical care, food distribution, and infrastructure repair. Kethver's metal fingers drummed against his wheelchair. They were conquering us with kindness. Helena smiled slightly. That does sound like humans. Zephyrian civilians in occupied territories began reporting that human rule was more efficient and compassionate than our own government had been. Some worlds actually requested to remain under human administration after the war ended. Kethver shook his head slowly. That's when High Command finally agreed to negotiate. Because they realized they were losing popular support? Because they realized that humans were offering something better than conquest. They were offering partnership. Kethver's good eye focused on Helena. Ambassador White and her team had developed a plan for peaceful coexistence that benefited both species. Jake leaned back in his chair. How did the war actually end? With a treaty signed on Earth. I was part of the Zephyrian delegation, representing military perspectives on human capabilities. Kethver's voice carried pride. It was the first time in galactic history that a major war ended with both sides stronger than when it began. How were both sides stronger? Humans gained access to Zephyrian technology and knowledge of other galactic civilizations. Zephyrians gained access to human creativity and adaptability. Kethver gestured with his metal hand. But more importantly, both species learned that they could accomplish more together than apart. Helena made final notes. What happened to you after the treaty? I became an advisor to the new joint government, helping design policies for interspecies cooperation. I also started working with Dr. Thompson again, developing medical treatments that combined human and Zephyrian knowledge. Kefver's cybernetic eye dimmed slightly. These treatments help veterans from both sides deal with war injuries. Is that why you agreed to this interview? Partly, but also because I wanted your people to understand something important. Kefver looked directly at the camera. Humans are the most dangerous species I have ever encountered. Not because of your weapons or your ships, but because of your ideas. Jake felt a chill. What kind of ideas? That enemies can become friends. That war doesn't have to end in destruction. That the future can be better than the past if people are willing to work for it. Kefver's voice became very soft. Those ideas are more powerful than any weapon, and more dangerous to tyrants than any army. Dr. Grant closed her notebook. Any final thoughts for the documentary? Kefver was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years and the hope of peace. Tell your people that they are stronger than they know. Not because they can destroy their enemies, but because they can transform them into allies. That is humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy. Jake stopped recording. The interview was over, but the story would continue for generations.